I learned something in trying to prepare for today's sermon. One, never let Mallory pick the book. And two, sometimes there's such a thing as knowing too much information and trying to condense it into a comprehensive presentation. So today I plan on being either comprehensive or clear in my presentation. I do want to offer this first, though. In 1452, the blueprint of what would become the doctrine of discovery was begun by Pope Nicholas V, who authored the papal bull Dum Diveris. He put together this imperative for King Alfonso of Portugal. Now, Portugal had already started the Atlantic slave trade 8 years prior. And this is the church's response: to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, Muslims, and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ whosoever placed, and therefore also vanquish the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable goods whatsoever held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply the appropriate to himself and his successors the kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert then his to his use and his profit. Another papal bull followed, allowing all European Catholic nations, although they weren't nations quite yet, to expand their dominions over all discovered lands. This pronouncement gave blanket permission to Portugal and ultimately all other European empires to capture and enslave anyone who would stand in the way of settler colonialism in perpetuity. Leading the trifecta of these death warrants for native peoples and enslaved Africans was Inter Caesarea, issued in 1492. In this edict, Spain and Portugal were given the right to colonize, convert, and enslave the Americas. Previous two bulls created a blueprint for what was to come. This one codified the doctrine of discovery, declaring the Catholic faith and the Christian religion be exalted, and everywhere increased and spread, that the health of souls be cared for, and that barbarous nations be overthrown and brought into the faith itself. I want to be clear that while we have chosen a book that focuses specifically on historical implications of the kidnapping and enslavement of people of African descent, that there is a wide swath of other people of humanity who have been decimated by those three edicts. Those are the three edicts that allowed for would-be discoverers to come into the Americas and genocide native peoples. The colonists, sort of allowed themselves to, all right, we'll go ahead and kill them because we can't enslave them. Native people knew the land, knew how to run and hide and fight on their own land. And so it's hard to track them down and enslave them. But the understanding was that eventually they would eventually be eradicated. Now, it's important then now to go into looking at the enslavement of people from the African continent, because as the course of history moved very rapidly, the mythology about race evolved. Prior to the definitive or codified or lawful definition of race and all of the hideousness that came from that in terms of a hierarchy of human value. You had people of European descent believing that they were superior to all others, and Christians believing that they were superior to all others. It's hard to separate them. But in the midst of our early history until the present, there had to be a way to rationalize how we could enslave other human beings. So this mythology of race comes about. And in that mythology, there was a definitive hierarchy. And so when we look at the native peoples of this land, they were considered slightly above people of African descent, simply because people of African descent were not considered human, or only 3/5 human. It's important for us to note this because it brings us to where we are in recognizing that out of that mythology, that people of African descent were not fully human, comes every single system that exists in this country for the benefit of people of European descent. And it has a boomerang effect, because as we create these systems that benefit people of European descent, you can't do that without definitively recognizing that they came about in order to assure that people of African descent were not allowed to have the same benefits. The repercussions then revert back to Native people, Latinx people, Chinese people, people who have come from Central and South America, people who have come from everywhere in the world whose color is not that of mine. And so it has this effect of we'll create a law, we'll create systems which will inevitably affect everyone of color, although they were specifically formulated to deal with the fact that emancipation had occurred and slavery was, quote unquote, no more. That's a brief history, but it's critical for us to understand that, because I want us to not take a stance of missing out on others who have been marginalized and whose oppression is not necessarily part of the intensiveness of this discussion. That's about all I have with regard to any kind of structured sermon for you today. When we talked about presenting and preaching on the cross and the lynching tree, I thought that's a great idea. I have read this book and reread it and cried and thrown up over it. I think I can approach it from a place of true introspection and theological clarity that perhaps would make sense. And the more I read, the more I realize, the more I am discombobulated by the horror of what it means to be here. So I'm going to sound a little discombobulated today. There is a part in this book that God can make a way. This is page 2, you don't have to look it up. Out of no way in Jesus' cross was truly observed to the intellect, yet profoundly real in the souls of Black folk. Enslaved Blacks who first heard the gospel message seized on the power of the cross. Christ crucified manifested God's loving and liberating presence in the contradictions of Black life. That transcendent presence in the lives of Black Christians that empowered them to believe that ultimately, in God's eschatological future, they would not be defeated by the troubles of this world, no matter how great and painful their suffering. No place for the proud and mighty, people who think that God called them to rule over others. The cross was God's critique of power, white power, powerless love, snatching victory out of defeat. Now we have to understand that the cross in Roman times was used as an implement of torture. It was used as an implement of fear. It was designed to eradicate the existence of anyone who hung on it. Once Jesus was hung on the cross, there was not supposed to be ever any evidence of his life. That was the purpose, to torture, humiliate, eradicate, and make invisible, annihilate the existence of the person who died in that horrible fashion. For James Cone then to look at that paradox of the cross and the fact that out of that came a theology and a multitude of Christian flavors that allow us to gather today is pretty remarkable. That there can be something potentially good that comes out of something so tragic is almost ridiculous. And yet, here we are. And we have to be careful that we don't look at that and say, well, see, that's all part of God's plan then. Everything bad that's happened has been for a reason. We just have to look for the good. That is so sickening. And yet, a lot of our Christian siblings do think that that is what this is about. So we are left with this paradox of the cross. And instead of looking at the cross as something horrendous and something that we need to expel, we use it as a symbol, right? This notion that James Cone says that we invert, that God inverted the cross to the extent of now we claim it as a symbol of something amazing, to the extent that early on, Paul writes a letter to the Philippians while he's in prison and says, there are enemies of the cross. That sounds ridiculous. Enemies of Christ, enemies of Jesus, but enemies of the cross. The cross has already become a symbol of something that it never should have become. Now, why is it important that those of us of European descent recognize this? Because for us, mostly, that's not what it means. For us, our salvation lies in the notion of believing in Jesus. Oh, I'm not believing. Believing in Jesus, believing in a life after death, believing in that type of salvation, right? But not in recognizing that the cross is representative of what we are supposed to overcome as far as the injustice of the cross. You, most of you, if you haven't read it yet, you will have an opportunity to. There are books downstairs if you haven't gotten the books, but I would like to hear from you. Some of your feedback, some of your impressions, some of your, maybe your inability to speak on what you have read so far. We've started with introduction, we've done chapter 1, and I really would want to hear some of what your feelings about it. Where are you in light of reading that chapter?
I was born in 1963, so after the era of lynching, and have very few memories of the civil rights era because I was a child. But I had grandparents who were very, very racist. And I recognized that as a child, when my grandmother said that she would kill me if I ever dated a Mexican. And I thought, my grandmother would kill me? Like stab me? And And something about that just made me furious. And I never respected my grandparents because of their racism. I know they were born in a different era, but I can't forgive them for not adapting. And I am still angry with them for their racism.
Trying to stay in the camera's view so that people on Zoom have something to look at.
I think the thing that hit me most and disturbed me the most about this chapter, there's always people that think they're right, whether they are or not, and do their own thing. And we read about, back in the cowboy days, people going off and doing justice on their own without going to the courts and stuff like that. So there's a part of me, don't condone it by any means, but there's a part of me that understands that that was what these people were doing, deciding their own justice and taking it out on people of color. The part that's super disturbing to me is that it was a spectacle, that people came, that it was entertainment, that's just unfathomable to me. That, like, whether I agree with something or not, and it's happening, people are being murdered unjustly. Again, not that I would condone that, but I would shrug my shoulders and say, well, what can I do to stop it? But to go and attend these murders and make a picnic out of it, it's just unconscionable.
Dita, you've been in this work long enough for me to allow some pushback, I think.
Okay.
The compassion that you bring to the story in terms of understanding people of those times is unwarranted. Because the ethos that allowed that to happen was one that said, people who have been identified as 3/5 human have no reason to live at all. So before we even get to the spectacle part, there is a national understanding that if you are somebody who has been enslaved or whose family has been enslaved, you have no right to life. So to go out in this extra legal activity of arresting because you are offended by the fact that a person of African descent, Native descent, Mexican descent is walking down the street comes way before the actual spectacle. So just wanted to.
Right. And like I said, I think I'm not good at expressing myself.
Oh,
I
you're
think
really good.
the whole thing was wrong.
Yes.
But and I'm not.
No, but stop there.
Okay.
No, but. And
yes, the whole thing was wrong. And what's even
yes,
more disturbing is that they made a spectacle of it.
thank you. Yeah, Derek Chauvin on the back of George Floyd's neck is a lynching, and it was a spectacle. It was seen by millions of people. Thank you. Thank you. Zoom, feel free to jump in. Okay. Aaron.
Yes, this is Erin. One of the things that stuck out to me was the inclusion of torture at these events, because I just did not know that that was a thing.
Yep.
And that really reminded me of how much sanitization there is of our history and what we're taught. And nobody's going to fix that. And it's on us to educate ourselves about it, hopefully in the future someday. But that was a great reminder for me. And what you were talking about earlier about other minority groups reminded me of a documentary I watched recently about the fact that when Europeans came to South America, of course, people knew Mayan languages and Mayan writing. And then Friar Diego de Landa was trying to understand their religion and engaged in torturing Mayan people by hoisting
Yes.
them, extremely similar, and ended up burning 800 years worth of Mayan books. And the only reason we only now have 3 or 4 Mayan books is because of Christianity.
Yes.
So I'm glad that you mentioned that it affects other peoples as well.
I'm going to take an opportunity of something you said. You were on target all the way. Because language is important to what we are doing, the word minority is not something we're using. First of all, if we want to look at minority based on skin color, guess what, gang? We're it. Yeah, you get that. Thank you. Anyone else? Go ahead, Mel. Oh, sorry, Matt.
Mel.
Real close.
This is Mel. My roots are European culture, but also in the Native American culture. And as a youngster, I grew up hearing the phrase, I grew up hearing the phrase that the only good Indian is a dead Indian. And this was in the 40s. And that stayed with me, this stayed with me all its time. And if you're part blood, you're all blood. You don't miss it.
There is an interesting, this is, I think, is a necessary diversion, given what Mel just said. Understand that the colonial enterprise, this evil genius around white skin supremacy, is this. It is about genocide. There is internal struggle among Native people to identify who is more Native than another, because our federal government set up regulations that says you need to be this part Native in order to receive federal assistance on your lands. And so there is this quantum, like you have to prove that you are enough Native. The flip side is if you are one drop person of African descent, then you are, and I'm not going to say it. Both are a divide and conquer mechanism that allow for internalized fighting among people themselves, and then also among people who have been marginalized groups among one another. Okay, so thank you, Mel. Matt?
To add on to the spectacle bit, not just a spectacle, but a family event, as multiple times described in the book, that really struck me, describing that as a family event.
Yes.
And different train of thought, just imagining as a parent, what it would be like to have a child that you have to educate them on how to behave in a way that maximizes their chance to avoid this horribly unjust situation. I can't even get close to imagining what it would be like to have to teach a kid that kind of stuff.
But to be clear, Black moms still have to do that, right?
Yes, yes. And let's look at the other side of that coin. Imagine what it's like to be a parent of a white-skinned child that you have to educate to stand at the base of the tree, cheering and watching and embracing the hatred and the atrocity. So when we talk about dismantling racism, it's not because we're doing something nice for those people. Our salvation is at stake. because of how we have been enculturated. Anybody else? All right. Not letting you off the hook with this one. We are talking about the cross and the lynching tree. We are talking about the murder, the torture. I want to be sensitive to details of other human beings. Whether you have read this chapter or not, I want to know how you are feeling. Every single person in here, I'm going to ask you how you are feeling in this moment. Everybody on Zoom, I'm going to ask you how you are feeling. 1 word, 2 words. You don't have to say much more than that, but I am going to find out and push you to name your feelings about this. Cayenne, are you still good? Okay, thank you. Just start it down the aisle. Just a word.
Yes, indeed.
How are you feeling?
I'm impressed.
Okay, thank you.
Depressed, mad,
Bring it up close to your mic so everybody can hear you.
mad,
Mad, depressed, thank you.
maybe some informed.
Informed. Not really a feeling.
I've already spoken.
Say again,
I've already spoken.
okay? It's not a feeling either.
Ashamed?
Ashamed. Go ahead.
Excruciating, angry.
Excruciating agony. Angry, thank you.
Well, of course, I just don't have one word, but I was kind of appalled at the people that they hooked up in the book so far as experts on racism, that they seem so complacent and dismissive. And
Wait, are you jumping ahead to another chapter?
oh, am I?
Yeah, don't do that yet.
Okay, all right. I'll save it for next.
Save it. Yep, yep, yep. You're right. And yes. What? You didn't give me a feeling. Appalled. Thank you.
Uncomfortable, but glad to be pushed to have the conversation.
Uncomfortable. Thank you.
Shocked.
Shocked.
Disgusted.
You.
Sad.
Uncomfortable.
Uncomfortable. Fair enough.
Horrified.
Sick to my stomach.
Horrified.
And uncomfortable. Embarrassed and uncomfortable.
Sad with the ignorance.
Can't hear you.
Sad with the ignorance.
Angry.
Speechless. Speechless. Thanks, Kathy.
My main thing has been being outraged that how did I never learn this in high school or college, and how it's just what else are we kind of glazing over, or it's just amazing. I've never really heard about lynching at all in high school.
You've been
college.
betrayed. You've been bamboozled. Yeah.
It's like, what else are we? Obviously, tons of stuff.
Thank you.
Saddened.
Saddened. Zoom people. Lori.
Sorry, couldn't figure out my unmute. Um, I couldn't see who was talking about their grandparents. I think it was Cindy, maybe.
Terry,
My parents were the same way, and I've always just felt sick and sad.
thank you. Nancy,
Challenge.
challenge, thank you. Donna,
Disturbed.
thank you. Amanda,
Part sick.
heartsick. Amy,
Like Donna said, disturbed and mortified, but glad for some more awareness.
thank you. Bob,
Sad, hopeless, depressed.
depressed, thank you. Harima,
Overwhelmed.
Justin,
But by how long has this fight been going on? You know?
Justin,
I'd say uncomfortable, hoodwinked.
uncomfortable, thank you. Linda,
Saddened and sickened
sad
and angry.
ending, thank you. Daddy's gaming,
Very disappointed, normally just in like people in the lack of understanding.
thank you. Disappointed. Catherine,
Grieving.
grieving. Wow. Yeah, grieving. Thank you. Cayenne,
I try to think of a word, but I can't think of one word of how I feel. But I really don't know. So, but I'll tell you what I think. I feel when I read this, I just feel like I'm not supposed to be here.
that's right.
But I also want to just comment on something in the book too.
Oh my goodness, damn it.
Gotta keep the mic real close.
Sorry,
It's okay.
sorry. But this is in the introduction. And it says, if white Americans could look at the terror they inflicted on their own Black population, slavery, segregation, and lynching, then they might be able to understand what is coming at them from others.
Amen. We don't know our history, and that's been intentional. Cayenne, you were not supposed to be here. Mel, you are not supposed to be here. This system in which we live was designed to annihilate, eradicate, and make invisible those that we hung upon the tree. In the same way that we celebrate through our Lenten and Easter season the death and resurrection of Jesus, he was hung upon a tree and he was supposed to go away. I said this to you a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about loving our enemy and asking the question, who's the enemy and is it us? And when we read this letter today of Paul to the Philippians, he talks briefly about enemies of the cross. And we have to ask ourselves as Christians, are we in partnership with the Christ or are we enemies of the cross? The cross was about demonstrating to the world through God's brilliance, imagination, and demand for justice that God's voice would not go unheard, that God's vision, imagination, and desire would not be unrecognized, that flipping the cross to the extent that Jesus was not annihilated, but still is with us here, for crying out loud. Every week we meet and talk and contemplate and pray and worship and proclaim and believe and everything else. Doing anti-racist work is doing the work that God demands for us to flip the outcome, to say, no, I will not go unheard anymore. Your shenanigans, your betrayal, your horror, your torture, your executions, your genociding will not silence my justice. And you who live in a space of privilege, who have been misled, cannot live there any longer. Because you have to be my voice. You have to be the one that says enough. Enough with the 21st century lynching of Black and brown bodies. We are not going to stand for it anymore. We are going to be as the early church and demand more of ourselves and one another, and take the risks necessary to live into dismantling a system that would maim and torture our siblings. See, here's the problem. Once you start knowing this truth, you have no excuse anymore to deny. Gotcha. That's what the cross is. It's a gotcha. Gotcha. Say that you follow me. Here's what it means. Here's